Okay. Good morning, everybody. I am Professor Kira Mattis from the Division of Public Policy at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and I'm here today to moderate what I think is a very important and extremely timely panel. If anyone saw the big announcements last week with the singing and dancing about Hong Kong being reopened, I mean, literally there was a song and dance about this. Kind of a fun one. And so this question is, Hong Kong and the world are still connected and valued internationally, right? As I said, I think this is very much top of mind for pretty much everybody in the city, from the policy level down to those of us who live here. And to take on this interesting and timely topic, we have a great panel today. We have our usual suspects, Professor Anthony Cheung, advisor and former president from 2008 to 2012 at Education University of Hong Kong. He's also an adjunct professor in the Division of Public Policy at HKUST and the former Secretary of Transportation and Housing from 2012 to 2017. Also joining us, Professor Louis Tai Lok, the chair professor of Hong Kong Studies here in Asian and Policy Studies at Education University Hong Kong, and director of the Academy of Hong Kong Studies at Education University of Hong Kong. And coming in remotely at approximately 2 a.m. British time, we have Mr. Brian Wong, who is a Rhodes Scholar and a DPhil candidate in politics at Oxford University and the founding editor-in-chief of the Oxford Political Review. So I think we'll go with kind of standard procedure. We'll give you each a time to give your presentation, and then afterwards we'll have a bit of a discussion and some questions about it. Okay?
Thank you very much, Kira, for your kind introduction. Well, the topic of today is Hong Kong and the world. The fact that we are discussing the topic this way speaks a lot about the kind of challenge that Hong Kong is facing today, because Hong Kong has always been identified as a world city. And in fact, right after 1997, in the first HKSAR Government headed by Mr. Cheung, Hong Kong adopted a brand name, Asia's World City. That was part of the Branding Hong Kong exercise. And until today, that kind of positioning still remains. And of course, again, during Mr. Cheung's time, whenever we talked about Hong Kong, we said, well, Hong Kong has got the backing of the motherland. At the same time, Hong Kong is facing the world. Now today, in the current government, the catchword was backed by the motherland, connected to the world. Essentially the same thing. But this is the official narrative that the government is putting up, following what the Central People's Government has been talking about Hong Kong's future. Okay, let me move the PowerPoint. Sorry. We have a slight technical problem here. Okay. Let me see if I can move it. Okay. Okay, we are moving backward. Okay, right now. Okay. Now, this is the latest slogan, Hello Hong Kong, to mark Hong Kong's return to the world after the COVID-19 pandemic. So the efforts of the current government are devoted to telling the Hong Kong story well, and to impress the world that Hong Kong is back on stage. The questions I would try to consider are two. First, is Hong Kong returning to a world that is still as friendly and appreciative as before? Now, we assume that Hong Kong was welcomed by everybody in the past. We have no doubt about that, but today I think perhaps the world is changing. The connected question is, are Hong Kong people fully confident in the city's future and impact on the world? And underlying those two questions, of course, is the Hong Kong story. Has the Hong Kong story remained the same? Now let's go back to the original Hong Kong story, Hong Kong's legacy and exceptionalism. Hong Kong's post-war success story has been well rehearsed over several decades. Hong Kong was able to play a very unique role in the past because of Hong Kong's special historical and geopolitical location. Hong Kong's interconnection between the two camps, the Western camp and of course China at the time during the Cold War period, the cultural influence of Hong Kong, especially since the 1960s among overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, in UK and parts of Europe. Hong Kong's integration with the Western world, economically, culturally, and institutionally, because of Hong Kong's strong relations with the UK and also the US after the Second World War. I mentioned Hong Kong's unique positioning during the Cold War period. In a way, as some academics have put it, Hong Kong was able to be a geopolitical buffer zone between the US and China during the Cold War period. Upon the gradual demise of the British Empire and the rise of Pax Americana. Hong Kong's economic success, I think, was very impressive. Hong Kong was already one of the Asian little dragons in the 1980s, and Hong Kong formed part of the East Asia miracle recognized by the World Bank in the early 1990s. Hong Kong was a role model for the mainland of China when China began the exercise or the process of reform and opening up in the late 1970s to early 1980s. And in fact, during the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping said repeatedly that there should be more Hong Kongs in China on the mainland. By the turn of this century, Hong Kong was already a very vibrant regional and global hub in trade, finance, shipping, and aviation. And by the early 1990s, Hong Kong surpassed Tokyo as the busiest international cargo airport, and then later on, the busiest cargo airport in the world. You see here the cover story in Time magazine. Hong Kong was part of what was known as New Long Kong, New York, London, Hong Kong, one of the three interconnected cities driving the global economy and connectivity. So all the good things which formed part of the Hong Kong story. One country, two systems, the formula used to facilitate the resumption of sovereignty by China over Hong Kong. That formula was meant to continue the Hong Kong story after 1997. And if you look at the Basic Law, particularly Chapter 5, it sets out how Hong Kong would have a high degree of autonomy in economic and trade relations. Separate customs territory, separate member of WTO and APEC. APEC, of course, was not mentioned in the Basic Law, but essentially the basis for that kind of separation or autonomy was set out in the Basic Law. And Hong Kong has been maintaining ETOs, economic and trade officers overseas. Of course, in terms of foreign affairs, the central government takes care of diplomacy. I mentioned the US-Hong Kong Policy Act here, which was enacted in 1992, because it's very important that the US was able to sort of support or underwrite, if you like, the one country, two systems formula. The act, the Hong Kong Policy Act, was passed in order to accord Hong Kong a special status in terms of US law. Hong Kong is to be treated differently from the mainland of China in economic, trade, finance, technology, education, cultural, and other relations. And I mentioned here too that Hong Kong, the US maintained the largest overseas mission in Hong Kong. The US consulate in Hong Kong was the second largest of its overseas diplomatic missions. Can someone help to remove this, which is blocking the PowerPoint? Okay. So Hong Kong has enjoyed the status or played the role as a superconnector between China and the world because of its close affinity to China and its highly integrated position in terms of connectedness to the Western-dominated international economic order. So in a way, we can say, well, Hong Kong was the best of both worlds, able to connect to both, to be connected to both worlds. And in that regard, we might say Hong Kong had a better geopolitical position than Singapore. Because I mentioned Singapore here because everybody nowadays is talking about comparing Hong Kong with Singapore. Okay, I think another problem. I'm stuck here. I can move. Okay. But things began to change because of what happened in the last decade or so. US-China relations have worsened, more hostility between the two sides, the change of US policy towards Asia and China. Today we are talking about clash of two systems. And in terms of Hong Kong, 2019 was a game changer, a turning point. The unrest, which was interpreted by China as Hong Kong in rebellion. So China was determined to sort of recontrol Hong Kong. The national security law was passed in 2020. Now, I will not go into detail. I think we are all familiar with what has happened. And then on the part of the US, the Hong Kong Policy Act came to an end. And now we have the US has the Hong Kong Autonomy Act passed in July 2020. Now, earlier I mentioned that Hong Kong was a geopolitical buffer zone between the US and China. Today, I think Hong Kong is a geopolitical hotspot. Hong Kong has been suffering collateral damage because of the worsening relations between the US and China, the new Cold War, and I would say the US-led Western camp is isolating Hong Kong in many aspects. So times have changed, and of course the challenges have changed. Here I have a table comparing the situation between the two periods. Before, Hong Kong was best of both worlds, and the world finds Hong Kong international, finds Hong Kong friendly, and English city, and China was proud of Hong Kong's internationalness. Hong Kong is a role model, as a model Chinese city. For outsiders, for overseas people, Hong Kong was regarded as outward-looking. Within Hong Kong, we were proud of having this so-called can-do spirit. Anything can be done, so long as people in Hong Kong are willing to do so. Hong Kong was a favorite among the expatriates. Maybe not today, but in the past, the expatriates found Hong Kong easy to move around. But nowadays, Hong Kong is in an infatuating situation. Suspicious patriots may find Hong Kong too Western friendly. The doubtful West may consider Hong Kong to be too Chinese, too mainlandized, the jargon being used. Hong Kong has become increasingly inward-looking because of all the internal doubts, internal unrest, the lack of direction, lack of confidence, local politics. And as I said before, the West seems to be isolating or at least marginalizing Hong Kong and bring down its global functionality. And in this process, Singapore was able to rise. I would say that Singapore stands ready to replace Hong Kong. Because should Hong Kong falter, of course, I won't say that is the destiny for Hong Kong, and I won't say that will happen anytime sooner if Hong Kong has the will to become vibrant again. But should Hong Kong falter, Shanghai or Shenzhen would not benefit. And I think the Central People's Government knows that very well. So how could Hong Kong relaunch the Hong Kong story? And I think people are questioning whether Hong Kong's present problems are just part of the pain of the process of adjustment, the treacherous path in front of Hong Kong, or is it reaching the end of history? But when we talk about Hong Kong and the world, perhaps we need to be more critical about what is meant by Hong Kong's internationalness, even in the past. In terms of international cognition, if we put Hong Kong within the context of the global north versus the global south, west versus east, probably Hong Kong historically was more biased towards the north and the west. So although we said since Hong Kong's return to China that Hong Kong is Asia's world city, but in what way has Asia been featuring in Hong Kong's articulation of its specialty of Hong Kong's strength? I think that remains rather doubtful. Nowadays, I think we have got this rather polarized view. For some people, the West is the best. For others, the West is a threat. That kind of a dichotomy seems to be emerging. In terms of telling the Hong Kong story, I think in the past, perhaps historically, we have been telling the Hong Kong story too much through the Anglo-Western lens than the Asian Chinese lens. And that does not apply only to Hong Kong, but to other parts of Asia. And in fact, since the 1990s, some Asian intellectuals have been reflecting on that, whether we have been looking at Asia through Asian eyes or through non-Asian eyes. The literature, international literature about Asia, for example. In terms of economics, yes, we have very active international trade, but perhaps our international connections were too focused on the English-speaking world, particularly the English-speaking Western world. Insufficient diversification to Asia, ASEAN, although we talk about ASEAN today, but ASEAN has been quite distant from us, even though geographically we are closer to the ASEAN than Europe and North America. East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, which the sea has just visited, we've been ignoring that part of Asia, where Singapore actually has started quite early in connecting to India, to the Middle East, the Islamic market. In terms of capital and talent, particularly in recent years, we find that we have been rather predominantly dependent on mainland capital, on mainland talent. So I think we need to reflect on Hong Kong's globalness if we are talking about Hong Kong and the world. In terms of linguistics, after 1997, we said we are trying to promote Hong Kong as a biliterate and trilingual city, English and Chinese in terms of language, and then linguistically, Cantonese, English, Putonghua. But very frankly, how articulate is Hong Kong society in terms of English or Putonghua? Nowadays, for example, when I visit banks, bank staff, they're so reluctant to speak in English. They're even reluctant to write. I mean, maybe this is part of the new internet or the social media generation. So essentially, I think Hong Kong still is too much of a Canto society, more parochial than assumed. Now, I'm not criticizing that, but I'm posing that as a question. How articulate we are as a global city. Compared to New York and London, the melting ports, particularly New York, to what extent is Hong Kong as much a melting pot? Not just for the local people and foreigners, but even for Chinese from different parts of China. In the past, we have no doubt about that. When I was young, I mean, in my teenage days, for example, we had the local people were people from Shanghai, from all parts of China, coming to Hong Kong. But nowadays, it seems we are trying to, I mean, we in terms of Hong Kong as a society, we are trying to make a distinction between those locally born and those who are not locally born, who are new migrants, for example. So there are many questions that we need to ask in terms of Hong Kong and the world, and Hong Kong's positioning as a world city. And in the past, the world seemed to be rather appreciative of Hong Kong, but nowadays perceptions have begun to change. Now the fundamentals, I think, remain intact. If we look at the World Bank's global governance indicators, we are doing very well in terms of government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption. In terms of political stability, the lack of terrorism, lack of violence, in terms of voice and accountability, in the past we have been doing quite well, although we are not in the top, but we have been doing quite well. But in recent years, if we look at this diagram on the slide, in terms of voice and accountability, which reflects the political system, which reflects freedom, for example, the perceptions have been changing. The score that Hong Kong is able to get has been on decline. So this is something I think we need to think about. We may not agree with the perceptions, we may not agree with the indicators, but this is something we need to pay attention to. In terms of human development, now this is the UNDP's assessment, the latest, 2021 to 22. Hong Kong is still doing well. We are being ranked number 4 in terms of the HDI, the Human Development Index, which measures health, education, access to knowledge, whether people have a decent standard of living. We are still doing well. But in terms of some other assessments, indices, we need to be varied. Now, the Fraser Institute's Human Freedom Index, the latest 2022, the overall human freedom score, 34 out of 165 different countries and jurisdictions. Now in 2017, before the 2019 unrest, we were ranked number 2, now 34. In terms of personal freedom, 62 out of 165. But we're still doing very well in terms of economic freedom, market freedom, the first out of 165. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, 88 out of 167 countries and territories, which is an all-time low since 2006 when that index started. In 2014, we were ranked 65. So we are gradually moving down from what is termed by the EIU as a flawed democracy to hybrid regime. Press freedom, I think we seem to be perceived as lacking press freedom, although I think those living in Hong Kong may not entirely agree, but this is something which is becoming doubtful. Now, if you look at the World Freedom Index, World Press Freedom Index 2022, Hong Kong was 148, ranked 148th out of 180 countries and jurisdictions, from 70 in 2014, and from 18 in 2002, right after the reunification. So these are some of the indicators of perceptions. Now, we may not be happy about them, we may not agree with them entirely, or even though, or maybe we don't really agree with them at all, but these are shaping international perceptions about Hong Kong. Is Hong Kong as international and diversified as before? Now, if we look at some of the indicators, it is a mixed picture. In terms of companies, non-local companies, there's still quite a number, but companies from the mainland have the most number. In terms of regional headquarters, again, we have regional headquarters of companies from different places, but 80% are mainland firms compared to 17% US, followed by Japanese, UK, and German firms. There seems to be a decline in the number of US firms in Hong Kong, a gradual decline. In terms of stock market, now that is something we need to note. The 53% of the companies on the stock market are from the mainland. But these companies constituted 81% of market capitalization, so predominantly mainland capital. The top 10 companies on the stock market are all from the mainland. Higher education, because we are having this event on a university campus, 62% of non-local students are from the mainland, 28% from the rest of Asia, and only 5% from the rest of the world, including North America and Europe. I'm not saying that only those from the West would be international, but I'm saying, well, these are the figures. In terms of postgraduate and doctoral students, overwhelmingly from the mainland. Tourism, before the pandemic, 80% of our inbound visitors are from the mainland. So when we talk about Hong Kong being international, I think we need to reflect on these figures as well. International media. In the last century, after the Second World War, in fact, Hong Kong was the headquarters of many international media outlets because of Hong Kong's excellent connectivity, closeness to China, geographically, open media environment, rule of law. But because of what happened in the last few years, some international media outlets, they are considering relocation. And some of them have relocated to Singapore and South Korea. And Singapore is interesting. I mean, relocation to Singapore is quite interesting because I remember back in the 1970s, Singapore had very negative image among international media because of censorship, because of all kinds of things. And as we move along, we are facing a great challenge in terms of maintaining Hong Kong's status under one country, two systems 2.0. Now, I won't go into detail, but the dilemma before Hong Kong is how to maintain a high degree of autonomy under the Central People's Government's comprehensive jurisdiction, how to achieve a colorful sort of local politics under the patriots administering Hong Kong principle, how to safeguard national security without eroding Hong Kong's freedom, human rights, and the rule of law, how Hong Kong people can embrace national identity while proud of their local roots and achievements, and how to win the trust of both the nation and that of the international community. So these are some of the reflections I would like to offer for discussion. Now, no city is immune from demise. If you look at other world cities in the past, Venice, Lisbon, Amsterdam, Liverpool, Detroit, for a while they have been great cities, but they have all declined in some way. So why should Hong Kong be an exception? I mean, if we pose the question philosophically, well, we have got the China factor, we've got the global future. Well, to what extent will Hong Kong benefit from the China factor and the global future? How should we take a long-term view about Hong Kong? And in one of my recent Chinese commentaries, I posed the perspective, FOMO, fear of missing out. Well, do we have the international community? Do they have the fear of missing out Hong Kong? Can they ignore Hong Kong? So this is really the question that people in Hong Kong, the government, should be asking. What is Hong Kong's strategic value? And I think Hong Kong's strategic value is always that of interconnection between China and the world. China that is continuing integration with the world, and the world that is still positive about China's future. Now, China may well still need a Hong Kong with international connections and good understanding of the West. Now, whether or not we are still very good in understanding the West in Hong Kong, that is another question. But on the other side, why will the West still need Hong Kong? And what kind of Hong Kong should that be? Can Singapore replace Hong Kong from the Western perspective? So these are really thought-provoking questions. And I think Hong Kong needs to reflect on all these issues and to reimagine, using a very fanciful word, renegotiate a new existentialism amid changing geopolitics and great power contestation in the region. So can Hong Kong still embrace the East while keeping strong links to the West? So that is the final question I would leave behind for further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony. So much to think about and talk about there, packed into those slides. But before we get to kind of questions and discussions, let's move on to our next speaker, Professor Louis. Okay, we've got the slides all working now this time, which is great. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think today we're addressing a very important issue, and then I tried to break down, well, according to the original issue posted by the organizer, it's, the question in two parts. One part of it is Hong Kong still internationally connected? And the other part of it is Hong Kong still valued internationally? And I tried to discuss these two issues in my presentation. Point number one I would like to make is one of the key challenges in front of Hong Kong is we can't afford to be complacent. This is a diagram showing you the number of regional headquarters, regional offices, and local offices of companies having their parent company outside of Hong Kong. In other words, mostly referring to foreign companies stationed in Hong Kong. And Anthony has already mentioned some of the relevant statistics in his one of his slides. And I must apologize that I used the not the most up-to-date figure. I'm using the 2021 figure, basically because of my old habit of using the first year of a decade to map changes. But the point I want to make is I have heard comments locally in Hong Kong saying that yeah, Hong Kong is doing all right. You know, we're very much still the same international or global city or world city because we're very much having these foreign companies coming to Hong Kong. The point I want to make is if you look at the aggregate figures, look at the aggregate data, then you would be quite happy because it's, you know, as you can see from the diagram, the curve is still going up. But if you do the further breakdown, then the blue part is the regional headquarter. Most of the time, this is the key part of it that we are interested in because it refers to foreign companies using Hong Kong as a base to coordinate and manage its business at the regional level. In other words, they're not just managing business in Hong Kong, but managing business in other parts of Asia, particularly China. So for most of the time, we are very much interested in finding out the number of regional headquarters. Quite honestly, if you look at the diagram, while the aggregate is going up, actually, in terms of regional headquarters, it's been kind of reaching a plateau for quite a bit of time already, and then in recent years, it's been going down. In the middle of it is the regional offices. This would be foreign companies stationed in Hong Kong, coordinating business within the region. In other words, it doesn't really carry out managerial function, but still an important office for managing business globally. Of course, it's a very simplified view, but basically, if you, at the risk of simplicity, you can see regional headquarters would be more important in terms of functionality. Regional office would be a little bit lower, but still it has a regional function. But on the upper part, that is the local office. It refers to foreign companies coming to Hong Kong, using Hong Kong as a base for only managing business activities in Hong Kong. So it doesn't have a regional function. So in the old days, quite honestly, we only count the regional office and the regional headquarters. But if you look at the diagram again, even for regional office, it has reached a plateau a long time ago, and then in recent years, in absolute numbers, it's also been going down. But somehow, if you look at the aggregate, of course, we were saved by the growth of local offices. The point I want to make is, if you just look at the aggregate figures, it would mislead you to think that, we're still doing all right because we still have foreign companies coming in. But in terms of functionality, in terms of the scope of management and the importance of using Hong Kong as a base, I fear to say that, it doesn't look as good as it is. And this is a composition of these local base with parent companies outside of Hong Kong. I'm again referring to regional headquarters. So you can see that in 2021, the share of US companies is 17%. Those from mainland China is 17%. From Japan is 15%. From UK, 10%. As mentioned by Anthony, in terms of numbers of US regional headquarters, actually has been going down. Actually, in the past 2-3 years, the same thing happened for companies from UK and from Japan as well. And to a large part of it, honestly, the number still maintained at this present level is mainly because of more and more mainland companies coming to Hong Kong and use Hong Kong at its regional headquarters. This is the figure in 1991. Of course, 30 years ago, you can see the predominance of US companies using Hong Kong as a regional headquarters, followed by UK and then Japan. So you can see that in the past 30 years, we do have the ability of attracting companies from Japan and use Hong Kong as a regional headquarters. But then the composition has been changing. So the first point I want to make is, as I mentioned already, don't be misled by the aggregate data, and don't become complacent simply by thinking that there are still foreign companies coming to Hong Kong, so everything is all right. We don't really need to look into the questions of internationalization. And as shown by the two pie charts, you can see that not only the extent but also the pattern of internationalization are changing. Increasingly, a lot of these regional headquarters are actually mainland Chinese companies. By itself, this pattern is not really a problem, because it's also a good sign to see mainland companies coming to Hong Kong and using Hong Kong as a springboard and also as a base for coordinating business, not only in Hong Kong but in a bigger region outside of Hong Kong, outside of China, but in Asia as well. This is, of course, one of the function of Hong Kong being a springboard for Chinese business of going out. But somehow we need to pay attention to the composition of these foreign companies, because well, I haven't really gone into the further breakdown, but if you say that, okay, it's fine without the US companies coming in, we're all right with other business partners, but if you look at the further breakdown of companies from France, from continental Europe, then basically the percentage is still very, very small. So it hasn't been having drastic changes. So again, we have to notice the significant changes brought about by the growth of mainland business in shaping the way that Hong Kong being a business hub and so on. We need to be aware of that, and shouldn't be complacent of thinking that things seems to be well, at least looks okay. Of course, another response to the question I just posed is saying that okay, I know that the regional headquarters has not been growing, regional offices have not been growing, but does it really matter? Because even though that US companies are not coming, well, so what? It's no big deal, because we have plenty of other opportunities in the rest of the world. We don't need to be US centric. We can do business with other partners. Recently, we talked a lot about the Middle East, of course, Belt and Road, and also ASEAN countries, and so on and so forth. So what? But the question I would like to pose is, are we really prepared for a new role? Again, Anthony has already mentioned this when he mentioned about linguistics. How ready are we to carry out internationalization beyond the English-speaking environment? That is an issue that we have to really pay attention to, because with my own very limited experience of doing networking in Belt and Road countries, I must say that my experience told me that without any knowledge of Arabic language and Russian, basically my experience of traveling in the Belt and Road country is that I was being discovered by my partner, not me knowing a lot about them. Is that they noticed that maybe Education University of Hong Kong may help them to do certain things, and they like to work with us and help them to go out. Rather that I'm informed enough to know who they are, what really they're interested in, and the kind of issues they're facing, so that I can advise and give consultancy and so on and so forth. So we do need to have a lot of preparations for that role. It won't come easy. You have to do something proactively. And are we really ready for adjusting our skill set, which I think involved not just by saying, for example, this morning, I think one of our local Chinese newspaper mentioned something like, we need to have more, in Cantonese is 中東通, experts on the Middle East. When you say something like this, of course, you can't be wrong. I mean, it won't be bad to have more experts knowing about the Middle East, about Russia, about other Belt and Road countries, about ASEAN, about Africa, about Latin America. Definitely would be correct. But the thing is, if you really are serious about this, actually it requires not just that we need to adjust skill sets, but also need to make institutional changes. Because we are not just talking about having an interpreter. It's not just about, before taking up our trip, someone in Hong Kong can speak Arabic. It's more than that. We need to have maybe a research institute doing research, understanding ASEAN countries, Africa, Middle East, and so on. Not only the history, not only the politics, but also the culture, religion, all kinds of things. And we are talking about investment. And we are talking about not only skill sets, but also to find ways to induce people to take up this kind of new skills. Because one of the things that we rarely talk about in Hong Kong, but somehow deep in our heart, we understand why. For example, one of the very important questions raised by Anthony, and then in our Academy of Hong Kong Studies, 2 years ago, we have a Asian Global City Roundtable. We talk about the same thing about trilingualism. Is exactly that, in Hong Kong, basically when we say we need to promote language, we are talking about promoting Putonghua plus English and full stop. And we understand why they are important. But at the same time, we also understand why for 99% of young people in Hong Kong, if you really want to develop your second or third language, you will still go back to Putonghua and English because they have economic returns right away. If you have the far sight and you have such a long-term perspective that, 10 years ago you said, I think one day we need Russian, and you have already done a PhD on, Russian culture and how to do business in Russian-speaking countries, something like that. Quite honestly, in the past 6 years, probably you'll be living in pretty tough conditions because I won't say none, but I would probably guess at least 85% of our local universities probably would think, can we really afford to open a new course on Russian politics and requiring our students to pick up a little bit of Russian? Well, for a long, long time in Hong Kong, we sort of ignore this. And to the extent, quite honestly, despite the fact that we have a lot of domestic helpers coming from the Philippines, coming from Indonesia, Takano is still a language that, 99% of people of Hong Kong simply assume that it doesn't exist. And then you don't bother. Even though that we have a lot of connections through overseas Chinese network with Thailand, with Myanmar, and so on. Again, we assume that, we either they need to know our culture rather than we reaching out and know the culture. So the point I want to make is our readiness to pick up a new internationalization perspective, how ready we are to really reach out to the non-English speaking world, and how we are going to readjust our skill sets, and also to build up the institutional structure for the facilitation of such a change in a sort of not only skills and knowledge of us, but also the ability to really reach out. And even though that is just about doing business, you still need to do that sort of thing. And in this regard, I find it encouraging to see top officials now going out, making new MOUs and so on. I think this is a good sign. But then the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, it requires something more than that, and it requires some sort of medium and also longer term institutional building investment in really order to allow Hong Kong to becoming really more cosmopolitan and international, of really knowing our partners in the rest of the world. But at the same time, I'm also aware about the second part of the question, as I said, whether we are still internationally valued. Because even though that, we change our mindset and ready to go out, the thing is, of course, do our business partners, do our international partners really need us? can they afford to miss out us and so on. So that part, of course, we face the challenge that it's shaped by the wider context, is shaped by macro factors, shaped by the changing international relations and geopolitics. Inevitably, US rivalry would make an impact on Hong Kong, the status of being, whether you are autonomous enough, whether you have differential treatment, and so on and so forth. And I think the challenge is not just about US, China, but also other Western countries as well, because if there would be attempts to isolate China, then inevitably Hong Kong would also need to face that sort of challenge if China being isolated. And at the same time, of course, it would also be important to see how ready China would maintain its link in the global context. Of course, Beijing has already repeatedly saying that, this is not a project of delinking, but then, of course, whether there would be delinking and how to do the relinking, it would affect the status of Hong Kong. But having said all that, I would like to make a footnote here by saying that sometimes when we discuss Hong Kong, especially in the past 3-5 years, there's also the view of saying that, the achievement of Hong Kong, the success of Hong Kong in the past 60 years or so is simply of having success by default because of China between 1949 and 1978 stay out of the world economy, and so Hong Kong benefit. And also because Hong Kong always in the buffer zone, and so you benefit from it, as if what Hong Kong needs to do is just nothing. It's just sitting there and then you would benefit, which I think is not the case. In fact, if you look back the Hong Kong history, especially the economic history, right from 1850s onward, one of the reasons for Hong Kong's rise in the world economy is not just because of the British connection. It's not just because of the connection with other British colonies and as well as the economy of Great Britain. Hong Kong's rose to its status had also a lot to do with the skills of people in Hong Kong to develop all kinds of network, especially via the global Chinese network. Other Asian countries, mainland, of course, Japan, and so on and so forth. And these global Chinese network, definitely you find how people in Hong Kong help to cultivate it, maintain it, and also, of course, make the best use of it. So in a large extent, I think Hong Kong's approach to this sort of international opportunities in the past has always been very proactive, has always been eager to take up and to reach out. And so I would like to come down to the concluding remarks that I would like to make is, I think up to this point, Hong Kong still have its own advantages. I don't think that we should write off Hong Kong's own, what I would call institutional thickness, because we have accumulated a lot of institutional ingredients to help us to do business, to help us to carry out all these sort of cultural exchanges and so on. And the fact that Hong Kong is still very international, it has its own history, and then we still benefit from it. But then, having said that, we need to think about how to further gear up for the role in China's overall internationalization. If China is not going to delink and to maintain this international profile, how Hong Kong would gear up. And I would think that we really need to think more seriously about the gearing up process, including how to further break down our role, our advantages, say at the regional level. So for example, in Hong Kong, I think we have some kind of laziness in in imagining new policy initiatives. One example I would think is, of course, UST has the Guangzhou campus already, and Chinese U has the Guangzhou campus, and then a lot of local universities have developed this sort of network as well as new initiatives in the Greater Bay Area. But it is quite a different issue to say that, what's the impact of these initiatives in really engineering higher education in the Greater Bay Area, and how Hong Kong would play the role in internationalizing higher education, but at the same time to maintain, China's own practice of organizing its higher education. How this would work out more organically, how this would make sure that Hong Kong would have a leading role at that sort of issue. Equally important, of course, is what's the role of Hong Kong at the national level. Of course, that on one side depends on Beijing, but on the other side, I would think that this exactly the last point I would like to make is Hong Kong also needs to think about how to become more proactive, to pick up things that we believe Hong Kong has something very special to offer. So in this regard, I would like to conclude by saying that I don't think Singapore would replace Hong Kong in that strategic role. Not so much because we are a lot superior. It's basically if China's need to carry out internationalization, it still need to carry out it via a Chinese agent. And Hong Kong being a Chinese global city, I think that we still have a strategic role there. I don't think Beijing would outsource to Singapore to carry that role. But again, having said that, doesn't mean that we just, sit back and wait for that opportunity. In fact, we need to be proactive in order to realize that potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that really thought-provoking talk. So we're going to finish up the presentation part of our session here before we get to the discussion again with Mr. Brian Wong coming to us from the UK.
Thank you very much. Can I just check that you can all hear me and I'm audible at large? Great, wonderful. And that you can see the slides as well, so I'm not just talking to thin air. Right, great, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for having me. And essentially what I'd like to look at today, specifically in this discussion and presentation, is two propositions. Proposition one, without the world, Hong Kong is nothing. And secondly, without China, Hong Kong is also nothing. And what I would like to sort of just flag as a methodological ethos underpinning this presentation is, we've just heard from two incredibly established veteran public policy academics, titans in Hong Kong scene, and it's a privilege to speak alongside them. So in lieu of delving into public policy intricacies and statistics and numbers on my end, what I'd like to take instead is a more theoretical approach, a more philosophical pondering over what exactly does it mean for Hong Kong to be international and re-internationalized, but also what does it mean to be connected to the world at large, if at all. So broadly speaking, in terms of my presentation today, there are three segments to it. The first is asking the question, what is the world? The second is to ask, what is China and what does China need today in relation to internationalization? And finally, what is Hong Kong other than its people, if at all? And these are the three segments I'd like to break down my presentation in. But if there's just one takeaway that I'd like to highlight before we delve into all of that, the broad upshot, and if there's only one thing you can remember from this talk, is this. In my humble opinion, the greatest risk to Hong Kong's competitiveness, viability as a society, economic future and prospects at large is an inability to adjust to a post-COVID and a post-Sino-US rivalry geopolitical normal. And that is to say, the involution, the de-internationalization, the tendencies and shifts towards localism at the expense of connecting Hong Kong with the world, all of these latent tendencies that we've seen building up in this very city over the past 2 to 3 decades, they may well be coming to a head over the next few years. And in order to preserve Hong Kong's status and Hong Kong's standing as China's most international, progressive and open city, it behoves us to guard against the excesses of those who want to see Hong Kong turned into just another mainland Chinese city. And this, by the way, applies from both sides of the aisle, whether it be those who are opposed to Beijing and opposed to China and therefore see, any and all decoupling from Hong Kong as being in their interest, because it proves and vindicates their point that Hong Kong is now mainlandized completely and that Beijing has ostensibly violated and reneged upon its promises. So that's one side of the spectrum, one end of the spectrum. But then there's also the other end of the spectrum, folks who say, in lieu of having one country, two systems, which was literally incorporated and institutionalized as a promise and as a vision in Beijing's outlined plans for Hong Kong. In lieu of having one country, two systems, these voices say, let's do away with the two systems and stick to one system. Both of these extreme voices and their backers, the choruses of supporters and the sycophants, in my opinion, are the greatest threats to Hong Kong's ability to survive over the next decade and the decades ahead. And in order to preserve what makes us great as a city, as a people, and as an ethos, we must be willing to stand up and defend, using wisdom, using pragmatism, and using the power of reason, the internationalist ethos that grounds us and makes us Hong Kong, as opposed to any other mainland Chinese city. And there's nothing wrong to do, nothing wrong with mainland China, by the way. It's just to say that as a part of China, it is our responsibility and mantle to maintain our international edge and connection, so to speak. With that said, let me now move on to the first question. What is the world? The reason why I want to ask this question is, when I see a lot of these discussions concerning Hong Kong's international edge or the lack thereof, is this intrusive tendency to just reach for sort of Sino-American comparisons, right? And look at how did America treat Hong Kong, prior to, say, the past 10 years of turbulence, and juxtapose that against the status quo. And then look at China. Okay, how much trade did China do with America via Hong Kong way back in the 1970s when China was an economically closed and largely, in many ways, deeply dilapidated and lacking economy, versus these days when China's effectively opened up. There's still barriers to trade, barriers to entry, sure, but it's largely opened up, and the extent to which Hong Kong could serve as an entree port for US-China trade is questionable, although not completely non-existent. The trouble with this sort of Sino-American or dichotomous framing in the way we imagine the world, either with China or you're with America, is that this fundamentally neglects the plurality, the heterogeneity of cultures, of economies, of interests, and also actors that comprise the world we inhabit today. So we can't begin to answer this question, are we still connected? Without first emancipating ourselves from the shackles of orthodoxy, from the orthodoxy that tells us, ooh, it's either the US or China, the rest doesn't really matter. Hey, at the very least, right, there's the EU as well. And we're not talking about the EU at all in the status quo, if at all. So what I want to just point out here is 4 core sub-questions undergirding this what is the world frame, that hopefully would prove by the end of this slide that essentially if we are to remain interconnected with the world, we need to have a much broader, more liberal, and also more voracious understanding of what the world constitutes. The first point I'd like to note concerns essentially the shift from a global north-dominated world to a world that is increasingly multipolar and features both global north and south countries, so to speak. And just to put things in sort of context, by global north and south, I'm using essentially a set of nomenclature devised by former German Chancellor Willy Brandt when he effectively said that we can capture and understand the world through the lenses of a line that you can draw all the way stretching through from right above China through Central Asia, and includes the boundaries between Russia and Central Asia all the way through to Eastern Europe down to Turkey, and then finally you've got the cutoff between America and Mexico. And his supposition there and his postulate there is that the global north reflects countries with economic might and dominance, namely countries like Japan, like Europe and America, and the global south, on the other hand, reflects countries that are economically underdeveloped and impoverished. And obviously the north-south sort of taxonomy there is not precise. You've got Australia and New Zealand that clearly does not belong for this typology to the global south, and yet they are geographically situated in the southern hemisphere. That doesn't really matter. That's besides the point. But when we started off in, say, the 1990s, when the American GDP was 16.5 times of that of China's, or rather that's the GDP per capita, and in 2020, it's only 1.82 times of the GDP of China's. It's clear that over these 30 years, there's been substantial catch-up by non-Western powers, so to speak, including, first and foremost, China. In 1995, the US and EU's combined GDP occupied almost 47% of the world's total GDP. In 2020, the figures decreased to only 36%, and that's provided that everything else stays broadly the same. That sort of ratio concentration is only anticipated to decrease further. The takeaway from this is we're no longer living in a world where, as if we were living towards the end of World War II, where the global north dominated the global economy, dominated global production, and seized all the primary and most lucrative value-generating means of production. That is not the world we live in anymore. We're living in a world where there is a global north that's still persistent, still potent. The West isn't going anywhere. I mean, I think America has a lot of gumption and also fruition and vitality in it, and is perfectly capable of revitalizing itself in the aftermath of the past few years of mess, right? And yet, at the same time, there's a sizable chunk of the world that doesn't belong to the global north. You've got Latin America, Middle East, the entirety of Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent. And yet, for some very bizarre reason, when we talk about internationalization in Hong Kong, we just don't seem to care and think enough about it. Instead, we spend all of our time talking about, well, how many American officials have visited Hong Kong recently? You know, I'm not saying America doesn't matter, but if all we're doing here is to look at the world through very reductionist lenses that are exclusively North-centric, then I'm afraid this is an anachronistic, an outdated way of approaching international strategy and positioning at large. And that ties me on to the second point I want to make here, which is essentially on this East and West, taxonomy that we often also hear being used to describe Hong Kong's positioning, right? That Hong Kong is the bridge between the East and the West. It's a nice way of phrasing things, and it's a quaint, almost idyllic phrasing. But I must nevertheless ask another question here. How would you classify the Middle East in this East-West taxonomy? What about Singapore? What about Australia? New Zealand? Is Russia Western or Eastern? Is Latin America Western or Eastern? What about Zimbabwe? What about Rwanda? What about Nigeria? What about all of these other countries that do not fit into this neat East versus West dichotomy or bifurcation? We don't seem to have an answer for that. And to think that the only things that Hong Kong needs to be bridging is the East and the West, defined by sort of Anglo-American and European powers on one hand and China on the other, again, to me, reflects a paucity of imagination. If we are to be an international hub in an international city, we must do away with this false binary and bizarre dichotomization of the world as we know it. And only then can we move our imaginary of the world beyond the nation state, beyond thinking through strictly just lenses of countries to countries to countries. But instead, that's when we start seeing the world and the things that we could do in relation to the world via frameworks like multilateral organizations, the IMF, AIB, the World Bank, the ADB, RCEP, TPP, all of these agreements, institutions that are possibly based and centered around nation states still in their core units of organization, and yet collectively they are beyond just individual nation states. What role can Hong Kong play in these organizations? Alternatively, we can also look in the other direction towards what occurs within countries, right? Municipal governments, city governments, provincial governments. In lieu of thinking just in terms of what Hong Kong could do with countries, like, what could we do with the entirety of India? Why not think about what we could do with individual states within India? Tamil Nadu, for instance, that houses Chennai. Or alternatively, you look at key core cities, Mumbai, Chennai, Hyderabad, and seek to court and engage these cities on a municipal level. Again, there's no reason to think that the international must literally be international. It could also be subnational, municipal, and individual people-to-people relations that make internationalization work. So the third point I'd like to note here is we must start thinking beyond the nation state and beyond the constraints and confines of quite literally the singular state as the basic unit and the sole and exclusive unit of our international liaison efforts at large. And a final comment on the world is this. We are our own worlds. We make our own worlds, And to see the world as defined by ourselves as opposed to by some external figure handed down from the top by someone who dictates a hegemonic vision that they shove down your throats and say, this is the world and this is the vision you ought to abide by. To me, the most important form of intellectual liberation is to emancipate ourselves from this sort of top-down conception of our world. We don't need, and we should not let others narrate our worlds for us, because we are ultimately the creators, the authors, and the agents that co-construct our very own worlds in its intersubjective reality. So with all that said, I hope I've established basically two things. One, the way we've been thinking about the international and internationalization in the status quo is not just outdated, it is also at its worst misleading. It is misguided. It doesn't reflect what Hong Kong is capable of doing, what it needs at its juncture, and certainly not equipped to tackle post-COVID, post-Sino-American rivalry new normal. But secondly, if we are truly to become an international hub, we must do away with this top-down imposition methodology to doing politics, where one or two singular authorities and figures in bureau decide this is what internationalization would look like, and so be it. That cannot be. That cannot be. And in order for us to find our ways forward, I would strongly encourage and firmly encourage each and every one of us to think about how we, as individual citizens, as students, as academics, could also become pioneers and engines of internationalization in Hong Kong. So rather than waiting for others to hand down edicts and hand down instructions and tell us what to do, we take things into our own hands, so to speak. So that's just the first point concerning what is the world and what does that mean for Hong Kong's internationalization. I now move on to the second question. What is China? More specifically, what are the problems and melee in China that require Hong Kong to remain international? Because to me, to answer the question, or put to us at the start of this presentation, it is nigh impossible to answer it without thinking about how we are situated in relation to our own country, which is China, And in all honesty, internationalization of Hong Kong is aligned with the interests of China. And it is in our interest as Hong Kongers to ensure that we can amplify the interests of China going forward when it comes to doubling down and ensuring that China remains an international and also globally connected state. It's on that note I want to note 5 problems or 5 facets of concerns that China faces in status quo that requires Hong Kong and needs us to play a more proactive role. The first is China's international presence at large and economic reglobalization, what Zheng Yongnian said or termed 二次全球化, 二次入世. So to re-enter into the global trade networks and to re-engage with the world at large in the aftermath of COVID. This is a huge challenge, and Hong Kong has a huge role to play, whether it be in arbitration, mediation, legal infrastructural building, financialization, and more generally speaking, providing high-end service value additions to China's relationship with, of course, the US, but on top of that, the EU, ASEAN, Latin America, Middle East, the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa, and of course, last but not least, Central Asia, which is a rapidly burgeoning and emerging region. I think the points raised just then by both Professors Loy and Cheung were incredibly fair, where they noted that we don't have the capacity and repertoire just yet to be able to add a lot of value. So the real question there is then to think about how we can add value, right? To think about the directions and the changes we could undertake in order for us to fill the niches and the gaps that China in the mainland or mainland China cannot fill, as opposed to seeing ourselves as merely constricted to, again, the US and China dyad, so to speak. The second problem China has concerns cultural reform and bricolage, where whether it be the homogenization, the essentialization, or attempts to redefine Chinese culture through very narrowly straitjacketed lenses, has in many shapes or forms constricted the ability on the part of China to advance its soft power, to cultivate a genuinely universalizable image that people can buy into. And I don't think this is the fault of the administration or the people or the society at large. This is a structural defect where Hong Kong could play a role, provided that we're able to preserve and innovate and also undertake systemic exchanges using what we have right now as cultural fragments and incorporating more elements of international cultures into our confluence, so to speak, or this melting pot of cultures. Hong Kong can add to Chinese culture. It's not just about taking Chinese culture and engaging in mimesis. It's about synthesis, it's about progress, it's about advancing Chinese culture That's something I think we ought to see as a core ethos driving forward our cultural, tourism, entertainment policy at large going forward. The third problem concerns the variety of economic issues that China is currently beset and riddled by, whether it be the strong demographic headwinds in terms of an aging population or an increasingly sluggish shift and the challenges encountered as it tries to shift towards a more consumption-driven economy. And finally, of course, the somewhat ossified financial structures and banking sectors within the country that's resulted in the rise of inefficient or zombified firms. All of these are policy defect areas where Hong Kong, again, has a crucial role to play, whether it be in establishing and rejuvenating the confidence and buy-in from international businesses and investors, or alternatively in providing the skill sets and training and the personnel structures required for China's transition towards a service sector-driven economy, or finally, in serving as a hub and an entree port for talents, for labor, for migrants coming into China. We need to step up to this. We can no longer rest on our laurels and say, and I completely agree with Professor Loy there, that all we need to do is to tang piang and pray that somehow we'd be graced by the good fortunes of the gods of modernization. Instead, it's high time for Hong Kong to reclaim its rightful place as the best means and the best vantage point by which the world accesses China to repair the wounded confidence, the wounded credibility that we see in the status quo in our very own country, and for which we need to and must step up to repair. Ties me on then finally to the fourth point on the slide concerning institutional reform. China has come leaps and bounds over the past 30 years or 40 years since reform and opening up in institutionalizing meritocracy and in implementing more enduring and resilient governance systems, and finally in streamlining the bureaucracies to ensure that there's more responsiveness towards the popular will, as well as through consultative and co-optational mechanisms that allow for the inclusion of popular will into governance structures, even without the governance approaches adopted in Western liberal democracy, so to speak. These are all changes that are positive, and these are changes that we ought to take seriously. But they're also dynamic, they're not static, they're not one-off processes. And to assert that China is therefore at the state of absolute perfection, brilliant, kumbaya, nothing else needs changing, is to me, and also to many of my interlocutors and friends and counterparts in the mainland, not an accurate reflection of what's going on in the country. And I think it behoves us as Hong Kong citizens within China to find organic ways to gradually and helpfully nudge China towards best practices in areas and dimensions where a rule of law, where modernization to institutions, where reforms to structures are needed in order to bring the country up to speed with the world at large. And this is not about pursuing a Western way to modernization. I do not believe there's one singular way to modernization, or that the only path to modernization must be Western. That's not what I'm advocating here. What I'm advocating instead is a pragmatic modernization, what Deng Xiaoping emphasized so ardently when he advanced reform and opening up as a primary engine of restoring China's economic might, and that he did with spectacular aplomb, that he did over the multiple 10 to 15 years of substantive transformations to the SOE sectors, to the private and public sectors, to legal institutions, to governance on a grassroots level. All of these were changes that occurred in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's high time that Hong Kong thought about how we can incorporate international best practices into, organically, the rest of the country's progress as a modernizing nation, as a nation that's striving towards and working towards goals of genuine prosperity and structural modernization, so to speak. So the bottom line is this. In my humble opinion, Hong Kong has a role to play in relation to China with regards to the country's internationalization efforts. We must serve as the bastion of reform and opening up, to be the first and foremost bridgehead to the forefront at the frontiers of 改革开放. That's what Hong Kong has always been best served by in terms of playing a role, in terms of acting as indeed that bridgehead for reform and opening up. We must not lose sight of that, especially in a post-COVID new normal where once again, the winds from the West may not be blowing in a direction and in favor of China, but it is up to us as a Chinese city to find that path forward. So this is the upshot essentially of my slide on China. And that ties me on to the final section of my talk today. What are we going to do? What's Hong Kong going to do? What's our future going to look like? I think the number one thing we need as a city within China is that we need a Chatham House or Brookings of its own. We need to think strategically. There's a lot of talk about policy, a lot of talk about, how to implement things, how to prosecute action. I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. And it's terrific that we're thinking about these questions, that this administration is one that is prioritizing outcomes and wants to deliver for the people. And I really appreciate that. I think that's something we should admire and call a spade, and also give credit where credit is due. The administration that we see currently in office is open to and very receptive towards getting things done and maximizing efficiency. But to complement that, what's needed here also is higher order strategization. We've got to think more strategically about Hong Kong, Quay not just another Chinese city, but Quay an open, international and progressive Chinese city that's a cosmopolis. That's the strategic positioning that we need to anchor and guide not just our integration into GBA, which is very important, but also our interactions at large with the rest of our mainland counterparts, and finally, our internationalization efforts as a cosmopolis. And it's on that front that I have broadly 6 to 7 suggestions that I won't have time to go into detail over, but I'd love to chat about them in the Q&A section that I think we can pursue in order to ensure that we can live and live on strategically. Firstly, we must gear our labor markets and education systems up in preparation for the multipolar world. So going back to the point that was raised just then by both of the professors, language proficiency in non-English languages right now is appalling. But actually, language proficiency in English and Mandarin is also appalling. So what can we do? What are we prepared to do? It is high time that we found ways of shifting gradually away from teaching purely using Cantonese and Chinese classes towards a bilingual curriculum that can incorporate both Mandarin and English, that reflect proficient fluent in our own language, which is, by the way, Mandarin, not Cantonese. Cantonese is our language, but the official language of China as a whole is Mandarin. And if we can't speak Mandarin, we can't connect with the other 1.4 billion compatriots living in our own country. That does not mean, however, that we do away with Cantonese culture and Cantonese language altogether. No. And in fact, we go to Shanghai. Shanghai folks speak Shanghainese at home. In Singapore, you've got polyglots speaking English and Mandarin, and yet at home they would speak Hokkien. And that's perfectly reasonable. So we can't and must not hide behind a shield of let us preserve Cantonese at the expense of linguistic internationalization. That to me is the first one I want to highlight as a suggestion. The second point to note though is we need meaningful and deep cultural exchanges to occur in Hong Kong. And frankly, there are few better places than Hong Kong on Chinese soil for that. We are by far the freest city when it comes to speech restrictions. We are by far the most internationalized, maybe say from Shanghai, when it comes to the demographics of our artistic and cultural communities, of artisans, of artists and residents, of academics and theorists and fellows that actually engage in cultural production. So it's high time, in order for us to rejuvenate ourselves, to take seriously the concept of bricolage. Bricolage as a tool, as a process through which effectively we draw upon the best, not just of the East or the West, let's do away with that too, but of all the different centers of cultures, all the sources of cultural and artistic creativity and innovation, we bring them all together and say, this is the place where you can experiment. This is the place where you can be creative. You can pioneer groundbreaking changes to the methods of art, the contextualities of art, the finer details of art, the critique of art, and the preservation of art. Because ultimately, art and culture are way more than just about selling art pieces through auction houses. It's about living and breathing an ethos of ingenious, of genuinely immersive spontaneity. And Hong Kong has the perfect room and base for that kind of work. And I firmly believe with our financial capital, with our class tier 1 infrastructure, and finally, our openness in travel and freedom of movement to the rest of the world at large, we can do that. And that allows us to find that soft power, our own soft power that has been so damaged and impaired over the past few years for all sorts of reasons. And only through then can we see a genuinely cosmopolitan Hong Kong that's international for art consumers and art creators alike. So that's point number 2. The third point I'd like to raise is that we must also employ finance as a leverage tool to reform ossified structures beyond the realms of finance. And by that, I mean philanthropy, non-profit, impact investment. We've got so much surplus capital in this city, and our financial markets are so much deeper, even as compared with Singapore's. And yet the utility and the value of the finance that we see, or financing that's going on in the city, are so constricted. And that to me is not indicative of any deep structural flaws. Instead, it suggests merely that we need to channel all that we have, quay capital, quay financial structures, quay VC and PE and innovation towards a plethora of areas that hitherto are unexplored, including doing charity and doing good better, including projecting and creating spaces for social entrepreneurs to truly pursue what they want to pursue, whether it be through local international collaboration or through bringing in international interlocutors and counterparts. And that's why, in order to make finance truly work for the people, the best means of doing so is to think more imaginatively about finance beyond just money, IPO, family offices. Not saying they don't matter, but that's not all there is to finance. And I'm acutely aware that I'm running out of time here. So I just want to close off with 2 further suggestions. To the extent that China has a demographic deficit and strong headwinds and an aging population, this is not an unfixable problem. In my opinion, Hong Kong can help tackle that by becoming the most attractive city to draw in expat workers, to draw in high-end, wonderful folks who bring knowledge, who bring versatility, and a repository of information and research and intellectual capital, like Kira, for instance, on a panel, who's chairing, this and moderating with spectacular aplomb. She's a prime example of the kind of wonderful human capital that we can afford and we can invest and must invest in attracting. But what we're doing right now is not enough. We're not reaching out to ASEAN. We're not engaging with Middle East. I mean, the current administration has expressed an openness to that, and for that I applaud them. But we need far more initiatives in thinking about what these folks actually want. What do they want from Hong Kong? How can we help them? How can we serve them? How can we be the best place to be if you're a talent who's looking to settle in Asia, looking to understand China? And there's so much more we can do on that front, even with the resources we have in the status quo, and just that. And that ties me on to the final point I want to make in my presentation today. Pragmatic idealism is the ethos that underpins our effort to steer through the very murky and turbulent waters. These frothy waters require an ability to be savvy, but also an ability to remain phlegmatic in face of daunting challenges, of smears, of those who are trying to besmirch and write off Hong Kong. We need to reconstruct a community united by a willingness to experiment, to disagree sensibly, and to disagree fairly. That whilst we're Chinese at our core, and a Chinese city at our hearts, and that we benefit from our own country and mainland China, we must also remember why we're useful to mainland China. It is not because we can recite, like most loyalists do these days, the most avowed, elaborate, and long, prosaic sort of phrases that affirm our performative loyalty. It is not because we can recite slogans. No. Nor is it because we're violent. We're not violent dispositionally. This is a very pragmatic city. We don't engage in violence. We don't engage, at least most of us, don't engage in destructive and diabolical protests. Hong Kong is Hong Kong because we are pragmatists. And it is high time that we did away with both fatalism and also performative mimicry in our search for a collective and international future for the city. And it is on that note, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Thank you very much, and look forward to discussion. Thanks.
Okay, a lot of food for thought here, and not a huge amount of time. And I think it was somewhat an accident of timing and planning and schedules that led me to be your moderator. But I think it's actually a nice bit of coincidence, because I probably have a slightly different perspective, or at least a different viewpoint, and hear things that perhaps other people in Hong Kong don't hear, that you might not, just by virtue of what I am, which is in fact a migrant. And so I have questions for each of us, but one thing I noticed that gets used all the time about people who from other countries who move to Hong Kong is we're called expats. And there's a bit of a racial thing here always, but it also implies an assumption about length of stay and our place in the city, which is superficial and temporary, which is actually belied by what we know about how at least certain numbers of people who come here actually do stay, often in communities that are less white than my own. So one thing that I want us to all be thinking about a little bit is that we say we want Hong Kong to be open to the world, but how open is Hong Kong to the world in its own culture? Right? How we talked about the melting pots of London and New York, which are both places I lived or have family. And I think it's a very interesting question about, once again, we come up to issues of language, parochialism, international expectation. If you keep the international community linguistically and culturally separate, how successful is that ever going to be? So that's kind of one thing in the background. So that leads me to Anthony, my first question. I share, I think, your skepticism on a lot of these international rankings of yada, yada, yada. I mean, both from an academic perspective, but also because we know all of these organizations that do it have a, how should we put this, perspective that they're selling in their various rankings, like The Economist and so on. But nonetheless, they do point to some, I think, reflective concerns, both in how people view Hong Kong, but perhaps, frankly, a somewhat realistic reflection of a changing situation. And I think the accountability and voice is an especially important one. I think what you see with those and what you put forward is the idea that with the changing political situation, with the national security law, with real issues about press freedom that have come up, what do you think are potentially some of the more kind of institutional or policy way forward to help make sure that this idea of voice and accountability in Hong Kong remains something vibrant and perhaps even increase to better take up, as Brian said, not just the views from a couple bureaus at the top of what international relations should be, but the feelings of people in Hong Kong who do this and care about it quite deeply. You know, how do we improve that a little bit?
Well, when I presented the some of the indicators or indices that reflect so-called international perceptions, I think I'm not trying to cast any precise judgment, because as you said, different organizations or media, they may have their perspectives. But I'm saying that they are also influential. Because, for example, during 2019, 2020, some of my friends in Germany and Holland, they wrote to me and asked, well, is Hong Kong collapsing? I mean, this is the kind of information they're getting. Now, it's a very mixed, complicated thing. I mean, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of academic activity. I think those of us who are in universities, those living in Hong Kong, we know, yes, there are new constraints, but at the same time, there is space. It's not as though what some commentaries have concluded about Hong Kong. But I think in terms of voice and accountability, if we track the World Bank's indicators, I think they do reflect changing perceptions. Now, it's not enough just to say, well, we are as free as before, because the context has changed because of the national security law, because of all the other things. Now, in terms of voice and accountability, if we want to prove to the world that actually we are even more accountable than before, then well, what about our legislative institution, our representative bodies? Are they even more active, even more vibrant, even better connected to the ordinary people? Of course, I think the reality is much more complicated, and I would say that we have not proven that point. So it's not enough just to say we have not changed, because we have changed. I think we have to admit that we have changed. But, well, in a new context, how can we demonstrate that we are as vibrant as people can expect from Hong Kong in new forms? But unfortunately, of course, at the moment, when Brian talked about dichotomy, I think in Hong Kong we also have a kind of dichotomy between, well, the old Hong Kong is best in everything. The new Hong Kong, I mean, for some people, is worst in everything. And then you have the other side, the new Hong Kong is best in everything, the old Hong Kong is bullshit. There's a lot of false legacy. I think we have to reimagine what we try to do. Now, I know that the administration is being constrained in many ways, but still, I think they can do better than what they've been doing to demonstrate that Hong Kong is really a lively city.
Thank you. Okay, so my next question is for Professor Louis next to me. Brian brought up an interesting idea, and we were talking about, how can we have the competencies, the language, the understanding, the study competencies to interact with these other places. And in fact, it's, if you get it, I will say as an academic, I had a grant. I advertised for an RA. I got a wonderful Polish woman who has a master's degree from CUHK, who's done her undergraduate and her master's here. And she speaks like 8 languages. And all of a sudden I had the best project in the whole world because she could go do documents and policy work for me on, half the EU. And I couldn't have found that if I looked. And I realized I couldn't have found that if I looked when she left. And I thought, how could we have more of this in Hong Kong? So what do you think it would take to have something like a Brookings or if we want that to be our model, or as Brian said, a Chatham House or something that was able to be more strategically engaged? Do we have to go find outside experts, or do we have a lot of that here already and we just haven't focused ourselves in that way? What would it take to get that here?
No, I don't think we have enough talents and support for that kind of strategic engagement yet. In fact, I think we underutilize potential talents that we would be able to recruit from other parts of the world, locally and regionally. One of the reasons is for long time, I think we have the old mindset of when you invest in certain things, or when you think that you're going to put resources in certain things, you're looking for very quick return. And if you're looking at very quick return, then of course you would think, okay, why do I need to have to give funding to, say, a local researcher to do research on Mekong River and cross-border coordination? We're not doing projects on dams in Laos or Cambodia, so forget it. We don't need that. I only need to know more about Bangkok or Ho Chi Minh City, and that would be good enough. First of all, we need to throw away that sort of mindset and look at what sort of global perspective we want to develop and cultivate. And this would be the first step to step out. And the other thing is, I think we need, I think Brian touched on a very interesting point, is we probably need to develop a new mechanism of gathering that kind of resources that people would think, okay, I contribute, but I probably would not we have any liability of, say, let's have a Brookings, let's have a Chatham House, because for a long time, I think donors in Hong Kong would think that, okay, if I support your project and you touch on a very sensitive issue, hey, that's not good to me, right? Because I don't know what you're researching on, and I don't know what you're really doing. But if every one of us put on such a, you may say narrow-mindedness, then it's very difficult to take off, because inevitably we would touch on issues that, in other countries, probably they would be very sensitive because we need to know. Or issues that, we need to really invest for a long time, because we need to know not only business opportunities in the Middle East, but also about their culture, the religion, and so that when we do finance for them, what are the do's and what are the don'ts? And these are the things that we need to take a new perspective. And so I think it's doable, but at the same time, we do need to have some new Hong Kong way of doing that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you. One for Brian. You mentioned something that I think is actually really important, which is that in Hong Kong, we tend to think about Hong Kong's place between nation states or even nation blocks. And the real I think one of the really interesting stories of the last 20, 25 years is the rise or the re-emergence of the power of cities. So if you look, I'm a bit of a climate person. If you look at the really interesting things going on right now, it's the C40, it's the cross-city compacts, it's Melbourne and Amsterdam and Shanghai, and Helsinki sharing best practice. And actually, you mentioned Amsterdam. Amsterdam's hot again, man. I mean, right? Cities come, they go down a bit, and then they come back again. And Amsterdam is like the leader amongst its peers. It's not for size, but for forward thinkingness and models of different ways to integrate into economies, into creating livable cities. It has all of its own problems too. But I think this idea about thinking more broadly, less about us to the Middle East and us to Dubai or us to Amsterdam, right? So Brian, what do you think is the potential for Hong Kong if it thinks a little bit more of itself as a potential leader and integrating even more? I mean, it's in these networks, but looking more to other important cities as models and ways of connecting, as opposed to nations, states, or blocks. Does that open up new space?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. What I would say is basically...
One second, the volume's very low here. We can't hear you. We're gonna fix the speaker.
One second.
Oh, much better, thank you.
Trying again. Gosh, technology is not my forte. I think I need some smart city experts to help me with that. On that note, actually, I do think smart cities and future cities is a core linkage and means of identifying common ground with, say, between Abu Dhabi and Hong Kong and Shanghai, and of course, Shanghai and Hong Kong and Amsterdam by extension as well. But on a more general note, what I'm tempted to say here is two things. Firstly, you're absolutely right, Kira, that city-based interactions and exchanges could become a source of synergy that cuts across national borders and boundaries, whether it be in terms of Hong Kong's status as a pioneer in ESG infrastructure and ESG financing. And I know, for instance, Christine Lowe's done a lot of wonderful work on that front, and Ma Jun as well, who's now based in Hong Kong and a pioneer in Chinese environmental activism at large. We can turn our city into a shining example on a hill, literally on multiple hills, that demonstrate what happens when you fuse highly densely populated urban centers with architecture and infrastructure that's suited to adapting to and also mitigating the effects of climate change. And beyond just investing locally, we can then leverage that as a source and an origin of soft power, which I'm starting to see signs of that anyway in the status quo. But what we need to do is really expedite the speed and also expand in scale and finally refine in detail and the due processes by which we make Hong Kong a more sustainable and livable city. So that's one angle there, right? And then there's, of course, the future city, tech-oriented city dimension that I highlighted just then. So digitalization, for instance, of Hong Kong, it is quite uneven in terms of its pace. So certain parts and elements are quite advanced, actually, where we're leading the world when it comes to sort of digitalization of infrastructure, transportation, especially payment systems, or rather, as opposed to payment systems. Whereas when it comes to digitalization of payments, we're lagging behind many of our counterparts in the mainland, right? So I had a friend who came down a while back from Beijing. He's been there as an expat for 3 to 4 years. He came down and said, gosh, you need cash in Hong Kong? I don't have that. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I guess you can find an octopus instead. The tentacles can rescue you. But digitalization of the currency and the economy is quite, sluggish at large. So to me, city-based interactions and synergies, yes, that's a broad direction, but there's a lot of catch-up work we need to do in order to really leverage that approach to maximal strength and to capture the greatest portions of dividends for our own usage. And none of this need be in conflict, by the way, with Hong Kong's ability to maintain relationships with economies, queer economies, right? So Hong Kong's relationships with ASEAN, for instance, is something that I personally am very invested in and interested in. I think there's so much we could do, both in terms of our status as an SAR within China, but also as an independent economy in relation to the 10 or soon to be 11 ASEAN states, really.
Great. So why don't we take one or two from the floor? Do we have any questions from the floor?
Hi, thank you so much for the speaker for your excellent sharing. I have like 3 points of my own summary. I found that now we are starting to look into the Middle East to we position Hong Kong in terms of our international engagement to see what will be the future internationalization for Hong Kong. I think like the first visit of our city's leader, John Lee, to Middle East serve a really good example for us to rethink how can Hong Kong connect with the rest of the world, with the Islamic world to speak. And I was just wondering, does the guest agree with me that whether Hong Kong has the talent, or do we have the people that is ready for this type of connection? Because from my own observation and experience being a university student, I see there are actually many many Central Asian students that is very familiar with the culture of Islam and also the culture of Hong Kong during the process of studying in Hong Kong. As well as we also have ethnic minority in Hong Kong that originate from countries such as in South Asia, and also some countries from Turkey, for example. And they are all people who have lived and are very integrated with our Hong Kong's ideas and cultures. And I was just wondering whether these talents are someone that we can potentially to activate into our part of the campaign for the new internationalization of Hong Kong. And I guess what's like the bigger question here that I'm really trying to ask is our city ready for this new types of internationalization and this market? And do you agree with this? And if not, what do you think that we can do in terms of the government and in terms of the university in preparing our city into this new ventures? Thank you.
Does anyone want to take a stab at some or part of?
Okay,
all of
maybe I'll
that?
try
Go for it, Anthony.
to respond to that. Now, I think it's good that the government is now trying to look broader into the world, but I don't think we should read too much into the visit to the Middle East. Because right now, the rhetoric basically is saying, well, we want you to come to Hong Kong to get listed, bring business, bring money. And in a way, it's contingent. It's not, I'm using the term used by Brian, contingent rather than enduring. Now, if we really see the world as more multipolar, in the sense that it's not just strict conventional East versus West, North-South, the world is more diverse, more pluralistic, then I think we have to ask the fundamental question, how open is Hong Kong to that kind of world? And the world is not just a very monolithic, in a very monolithic sense, because sometimes we talk about the political East and West, but there is a cultural or economic East and West. So when we talk about the Middle East, we really say, well, the Middle East needs to be looked at beyond the economic aspect, institutionally, culturally, historically. What is the Middle East represent? I think that needs to be considered as well. And then I think we should not just say, well, in future, we expand our relations with ASEAN, with the Middle East, at the expense of the West, in the broad sense. Because I think historically and up to now, and maybe into the future, Hong Kong's uniqueness to China is that we have got this advantage of connecting to the West in a broader sense. And we should not lose that advantage, if that is still an advantage.
What's the statistics these days on Hong Kongers with Canadian passports? I mean, we also talk about it as if Hong Kongers are one thing and then they're the other. And in fact, Hong Kongers are fascinating to me. The degree to which my students have themselves been educated and lived across a variety of different contexts, Australia, Canada, the UK. I mean, often English speaking for kind of obvious reasons, but nonetheless. Brian, you have a point?
Yeah, it's just a very quick point, actually. So I think Hong Kong certainly could play a role, specifically in relation to the Middle East, when it comes to mobilizing Arabic educators, instructors, and improving the curricula and the quality of education we deliver on not just Middle Eastern cultures and religious studies in terms of Islam, but also the subsidiary intersections between that and the fortes that we have. So, for instance, Islamic financing, the issuing of Sukuk bonds, understanding what the taboos and the limits to Islamic finance are and how we can complement them in Hong Kong. I mean, Islamic finance is still a pretty nascent field in many financial centers around the world, but London is leading the world and leading the pack when it comes to the sophistication and quality of services along those lines. Can we in Hong Kong mobilize the legal resources and the personnel we have in order to develop a more sophisticated understanding of Sukuk? I certainly think there's space and appetite for that. And additionally, can we create, say, RMB security exchange functions? So this is a point that James Fock raised earlier on in SAMP op-ed, actually, where he talked about establishing something like a stock connect or stock exchange program between, the mainland Chinese market and the Saudi Arabian, or more generally speaking, the Gulf regions markets, and using Hong Kong as the central sort of linchpin to that, right? These are ways by which we can imaginatively leverage our existing strengths, build upon what we've got already in relation to the Middle East, and I certainly think the government is open and receptive to such suggestions. But that's just a minor point concerning the Gulf at large. So sorry for butting in. Conscious of time.
That's very good. I think we have some questions in the chat. Is there one?
Yeah, I can join if you allow me to speak.
Mm. Can
you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm Peter Cheung from Education University. I joined the forum late. I'm sorry if my question have been covered, so you can ignore them. I have two questions. The first one is, how should Hong Kong react or respond if there is an escalation of military conflict across the Taiwan Strait in the near future? This is my first question. The second question is, I agree very much with what Brian said about what Hong Kong should or can do, but we have to take into account the institutional structure and the institutional dynamics of the current political system in Hong Kong. Does any speaker here think that Hong Kong's political structure and leadership can now take on board some of these suggestions put forward by Brian? Thank you.
Maybe dialogue first, and then I can supplement.
Sure.
For the political structure itself, or the political institution itself, I think the current challenge for me is not so much of having the space or the capacity to address some of the issues raised by Brian or Anthony or myself. I do think that putting them onto agenda, raising some of the issues and deliberating on them and turn them out into doable policies, I do think that it's doable. But the real challenge in front of us now is we are, how would I say it? I see the sort of current discussion, or the sort of, if you call them debate, in the chamber is flattening. It's tuning down to the extent that it's not even come to the point that if people have different views and different opinions, or even trying to oppose a government proposal, that would turn into a productive dialogue and discussion. And this, I don't see it as institutional, but probably something that in the next few years we need to retune the sort of political dynamics and the way that we operate in Hong Kong, and in order to address that sort of thing. But whether we would be able to take it on board within the existing structure, I do think that is doable.
Well, I think the most important thing is whether we have the confidence and whether we are daring enough. I mean, I agree fully with dialogue that whatever we have said among the three of us, the speakers, I think that we want to have a Hong Kong that's still relevant to the world, to China, a Hong Kong that has an impact. But first of all, do we ever dare to think that Hong Kong has an impact? For example, talking about the Taiwan Strait, the tension, I think certainly if there's any military event, any military incident, that will be damaging to national interest, to Hong Kong, and it's not a good thing for the world. Now, of course, ultimately, there are things that are beyond Hong Kong's control. But honestly, can we ask ourselves in Hong Kong, our leaders, business leaders, political leaders, do we have some influence over the national policy? Now, I think if we are to be a great city of China, then we should ask that question ourselves. We are not just following central government directive. We also try to have interaction, try to have an influence. If you ask someone in Shanghai, they will say, well, we try to have contribution to national policy. So first question, Hong Kong, do we dare to have an influence over China? Secondly, in terms of broadening our connections, the Middle East, Asia, and so on, do we have a vision? And do we have a supporting narrative? I mean, for example, Middle East, why Middle East? ASEAN, why ASEAN? It's not contingent, it's not something contingent. Now, let me take a bit of time to tell a story. I think it's almost 2 decades ago when in Singapore, the previous Prime Minister, Goh Now, once during the Chinese New Year, Goh paid a visit to the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce. And at that time, Singapore was very keen to develop economic links, activities in China. China is a sort of a booming market. And you will imagine, Lunar New Year, the Prime Minister visits the Chinese Chamber of Commerce. And you will imagine he would say a lot of things about China, the prospect of the China market and so on. But instead, on that particular visit, he said Singapore should develop economic links with India, South Asia. And I think to me, that is quite illuminating. In other words, it indirectly reflects the Singapore leadership's mission. So it's not just China, because Singapore has a sizable Indian community as well, so India. And Singapore, in fact, in terms of Islamic finance, started quite early, much earlier than Hong Kong, in terms of connecting to the Arab world. Singapore recognized the importance of the Islamic world much earlier than Hong Kong. Hong Kong, in a way, was being forced into embarking on the Middle East because of what happened right now. So I think, yes, we should go into the Middle East. We should go much deeper into Asia. We've been calling ourselves Asia's world city, but we have forgotten Asia sometimes. But we need a more daring narrative.
What about India? South Asia, South Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, India, Nepal. It's our largest expat outside of really our Filipino helper community, right? I mean, are we underutilizing that? Or do we fail to recognize it? I get this feeling sometimes.
I think we haven't got this Asian narrative. When we say, well, we are Asia's world city, we just take it as something for granted because of what we have been doing as a global city. But in fact, if we look at how we deal with Asia, we have not done enough.
Brian, you have your hand up. Do you have a quick thing?
So on India, very quickly, I was just going to say, I think what we've omitted thus far is the importance of Hong Kong as a source of cultural capital and also economic bilateral exchanges or multilateral financialization for Indian firms that exist independently of our relationship with China. Because obviously Sino-Indian relations are very complex. You've got the border issues, LAC, Kashmir, 1960, so on and so forth. We can admit all of that, but if we just focus on Hong Kong in relation to India, I actually think a lot of sort of subnational entities, local and provincial parties, or just businesses at large, they eye Hong Kong as an incredibly important basis for family wealth management and asset management. And we just need to leverage and seize upon that, not just in reaching out to them, but also in building a sense of camaraderie and solidarity with them. Again, leveraging municipal sort of track to exchanges and dialogue at large. And going back to Peter's point concerning, are we equipped? I think we've got a think tank industry that could potentially be very powerful. So Asia Global Institute, for instance, in Hong Kong has been doing a lot of wondrous work over the past few years in just trying to foster a better understanding of Asia in Hong Kong. Quay, again, as Professor Cheung said, just in Asia's world city. We've also got wonderful professionals and academics, such as the three titans we have here today on the panel, they too can contribute towards policy making. The question is the government able to and willing to listen and to engage through consultative mechanisms, but also not just formal systems, but informal engagement repertoire, the talents we have in Hong Kong? That to me is a question for which the jury's still out. And honestly, I think we've got to wait and see. But I do hope that the new CEPU, CE policy unit, can do more at bridging that gulf and gap there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I see we're right at time. I know we have one more person holding a microphone, so I'd like to propose the following. Please ask us your question, and then I'm going to ask each panelist to kind of sum up and hopefully address your question a little bit, but to kind of, so we can just wrap it all up. Does it, okay? Everyone? Okay, so please. So Brian couldn't hear, the mic wasn't on. The question was, what do we think about the situation of kind of the economic and otherwise integration with the Greater Bay Area, given the kind of, well, we're opening up again, but we did kind of have a dip in our integration for a little while.
First of all, Hong Kong has to adjust its mindset about the Greater Bay Area. Because even up to now, oftentimes in open discussion, we treat the Greater Bay Area as if outside Hong Kong. But in fact, Hong Kong is part of the GBA. Hong Kong is regarded by the central government as being one of the major engines of growth, development of the GBA. So we have to take up the GBA. It's not just as though GBA is the dumping ground for things we don't want, or the source of money or talent, whatever. I think the mindset change is very important. Now, on a more practical level, and that's what you are asking, are there hurdles, constraints, boundaries that are preventing Hong Kong from interacting better, collaborating better with other cities in the GBA? In fact, there are, because we are talking about one country, two systems. And in fact, if you count Macau as slightly a different system, then we have three systems, three sets of governance, laws, and so on and so forth. So it's important that we try to break down barriers, try to address real issues of that at the moment make it difficult for the flow of people, for the flow of information. But that is a very challenging issue. Let me, for example, right now, the central government has agreed that Hong Kong vehicles with only the Hong Kong car plate can go north, right? Now, that proposal started during my time as Secretary for Transport and Housing, when in C.Y. Leung's administration. We made the proposal. We started the proposal, and the proposal was supported by Guangdong. But then you can see that it has taken so many years for a final decision to be made, because various agencies, law enforcement agencies on the mainland, in Hong Kong, at the top level, at the local level, they have various concerns. So I would not underestimate the complexity or some of the difficulties. But if we really want Hong Kong to be a vibrant, one of the vibrant leaders of the GBA, then we have to devote more efforts to facilitating that kind of interval.
Well, very quickly, I think from day one, I mean, Hong Kong's own internationalization is always closely connected with mainland China, especially southern part of China. So it's really, again, going back, briefly mentioned by Anthony, is about the Hong Kong's assumption of the kind of role that we want to take, how we're going to shape GBA, as well as allowing different flows of people, capital, and talents, and so on to change Hong Kong as well. And so, in a way, that if I use one sentence to sum up my own presentation today, is Hong Kong really need to restart its own organicity in a way, how we are being organically connected with the world as well as the national and the regional. And this is the way to make Hong Kong really back into the world again.
Brian, a final thought for us?
Thank you. So in my humble opinion, I think Hong Kong's future is best served by our becoming the most cosmopolitan and international and progressive city on Chinese soil. And that extends to also its role within GBA. We are a part of GBA in the status quo, and that will remain the case. It's a very exciting area with an economy that could soon, and if not already, has overtaken the size of Korea, and is on its way to indeed becoming a very prominent economic actor on a world stage at large, independently, just like the Californian Valley region and the Bay Area at large. But the real challenge for GBA and all of these cities, the 11, right, the 9 cities plus the 2 SARs, is to find a means by which the sum, or rather it could be more than just the sum of its individual parts. And that to me is an area where Hong Kong could help, whether it be in decluttering, in streamlining processes, in offering ideas and innovation in public policy and governance, in generating financial structures that are indeed sustainable and enduring and generate more capital to fuel the innovation and also blue sky long-term investments that you need for the region. But the challenge for GBA, and also the existential question for Hong Kong, is how can we create, as opposed to just, to use a Cantonese phrase, sit low-born, because that's not going to get us very far. And I guess the translation of that is to basically sit on our laurels. We can't rest on our laurels. We've got to keep moving. Keep moving forward, because that's the only way out for us all. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thanks.
So I think, just to sum up here, I think this is, as I said, a very timely topic. And I think there's a lot of anxiety in Hong Kong about what the future holds now that we're opening up again. And I think there's a lot of introspection, and maybe we underestimate ourselves as a city some days. I think it's very easy to look at the last few years and feel a little bit glum about, we got cut off for a long time, and now we're kind of trying to find our way back. And I think we've pointed out to ways this is both a project, kind of a top-down, we need government institutions and policies, but also perhaps to have a little bit more faith in the people of Hong Kong and the culture of Hong Kong, and the capacity. I mean, we say, is Hong Kong just going to be another mainland Chinese city? And I don't think it's going to happen without wiping half the things on the city off the face of the earth. I mean, just go out to eat. Seriously, look around. Look at the way Hong Kongers eat, and the music they listen to, and the art and culture we have, and those elements of what makes the city vibrant. And I don't think you can argue that exists anywhere else in China. And I think those elements are strong in Hong Kong culture for all of these things. And so I think that, there's a lot of interesting questions looking forward. I think this was a great discussion about how both the kind of bottom up and top down can contribute to this. And it's certainly not a clear pathway, but I don't think I don't think we're on the road to ruin either, right? Singing and dancing flight attendants on stage last week aside, right? Hong Kong is open again, and I think I think it'll be a fascinating future. So thank you all for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much.